Welcome to this presentation on the iAdopt framework created by the GoFair Foundation in collaboration with the iAdopt working group of the Research Data Alliance, RDA. iAdopt stands for Interoperable Descriptions of Observable Property Terminology. The core members of the RDA iAdopt working group developed a systematic way to represent variable descriptions in a fair way. This video will help you to understand this iAdopt framework. iAdopt is a framework to standardize the description of variables. This framework makes existing variable descriptions interoperable through machine-readable metadata. It acts as a semantic broker by enabling mappings to a common representation by adding rich human and machine-readable descriptions. These descriptions are language independent because they are based on a semantic model that can be easily applied in multiple languages. These semantic enrichments are implemented with qualified references using so-called object properties by specifying the role a concept plays within the variable description. One of the great benefits of using this framework is that the existing data structures do not need to be changed. Variables are used to describe which properties are observed and represented in data and are therefore at the core of observational science data. However, often they are not fair because they do not follow any syntax rules and use free text, which makes them hard to understand, compare, and reuse, especially for machines. iAdopt is a framework that addresses this challenge by adding metadata to a digital object. Metadata provides informational context to data. Metadata is essential for making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable by machines and humans. To make data fair, the metadata itself also needs to be fair. Fair metadata requires persistent identifiers pointing to terminologies using web standards. The iAdopt working group published recommendations endorsed by the Research Data Alliance in 2022. These include data creators and data curators or data publishers should describe the variables of their datasets in human and machine-readable format. The variable description should contain sufficient information so that the data can be reused with minimum reliance on free text documentation. The description should use fair semantic artifacts, e.g. controlled vocabularies or ontological relationships, and be compatible with linked data. The description should follow a decomposition approach consistent with the classes and relationships defined in the iAdopt ontology. Reuse existing terminologies that are aligned with the iAdopt framework. If none is appropriate, you may either propose to extend existing terminologies or create a new variable description following the iAdopt framework. iAdopt helps to describe what we observe. So we look at a specific property, which can be a qualitative property like color or a quantitative property like temperature. To be understandable, the property description requires context, so the iAdopt variable is a contextualized property. The iAdopt variable consists of a property, but it needs additional description components. These are often multiple components. The iAdopt working group developed a simple OWL ontology for the description pattern of an iAdopt variable and an associated variable set. iAdopt Variable Modeling Challenge focuses on the core model, which ignores the variable set. The core model involves 5 classes and 11 object properties and cardinalities for each relation, like a variable must have one and only one property, but can have, for example, an arbitrary number of context objects. In this overview, we will not cover the variable set class, which is an aggregation class to group a set of variables. Note that we do not include the unit of measure as a component of the description, which is evidently very relevant for quantitative variables. The unit is an essential component of the metadata of a measurement as a whole, and it must be specified, but it should be separate from the description of what the variable is. This is because a variable can be expressed in different units. The description components of an IADOPT variable are the property and the various entities that serve different roles in the description. These roles are represented as specific relations, so-called object properties in the ontology. While the role representation is semantically correct, this can be translated into a simplified view where an IADOPT variable has these components: property, object of interest, matrix, and context object. An IADOPT variable requires at least one property and one object of interest. The property is a characteristic of an entity which plays the role of an object of interest. Some of the simpler variables will not need more. Let's illustrate this with an example. Wind speed is a non-complex variable. Wind speed can be decomposed into two components, wind and speed, where wind is the entity in the role of the object of interest and speed is the observed property of the wind. Most variables are complex and require more description components. In addition to property and object of interest, they can have an optional matrix, which is an entity in which the object of interest is contained. They can also have several context objects that are entities that provide additional background information regarding the object of interest. Let's analyze a more complex variable and apply the IADOPT framework to it: water level of a lake. We can identify three different atomic parts in the description: level, water, and lake. The water level needs to be interpreted, and some domain knowledge is required in order to describe it as a property. It is defined as the vertical measure of length, distance, from the surface to the bottom of a water body, in other words, the depth. The entity water body needs to be introduced as the object of interest so that it can be associated with its property depth. Lake is the matrix in which the observed water body is contained. If required, surface water can be added as a context object to ensure the variable is clearly labeled as relating to surface water and not groundwater. All the entities, but not the property, included in the description can be constrained by one or more constraints. A constraint must include the pointer to the entity it constrains. Applied to our example, we may need to add constraints if the variable is level of water in lake, stagnant surface water. The constraint stagnant constrains the context object surface water. Nevertheless, this variable can also be represented without using a constraint if a more specific term for the context object is available, e.g. stagnant surface water, which is a narrower concept than surface water. Using mappings between these different representations, it is possible to accept both variants. After decomposing the description of IADOPT into logical atomic parts, we need to find appropriate terms from terminologies like thesauri or ontologies. For this example, we use the Qt ontology for the property depth, the NERG vocabulary server for the entity water body, NVO for lake, and for the others we use the envthes. For the description terms, you can use any terminology as long as it is maintained and interoperable with other terminologies. Here you can also see how the representation is expressed as machine-readable RDF in Turtle syntax. Let's take another example that is also about the property of a water body, sea surface skin temperature. In this example, the temperature measured is that of the sea surface skin layer, which is thus the object of interest. This entity is contained within a broader matrix environment, which is the water body. However, the variable could be minimally defined with temperature as the property and sea surface skin as the object of interest. But water body can also be added as the matrix to further define the context of the variable and facilitate consistency and interoperability. Find other modeled variable examples on this website, where you can see how the description components have been annotated and represented as turtle files.